Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Your Health, Your Choice with Dr. David. Today, we are going to be talking about the Pfizer COVID vaccine authorization for children ages 5 through 11. Hi, Dr. David.
Hello. How are you today?
All right. So one of the reasons we're talking about this is because just this past week, the FDA Committee for Vaccines met and had a whole discussion on whether or not the data panned out to make it sufficient for them to approve this vaccine for ages 5 through 11. Prior to now, it has only been available to those ages 12 and up. Dr. David was one of a handful of people that was invited to present to the FDA Vaccine Committee as a board-certified pediatrician, his opinions regarding the authorization process. So today, we're going to give you a little bit of the background of it. We're going to talk about what his experience was like in preparing and presenting to the FDA, and then we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into the topic. So David, let's start off just by saying, how did you feel that it was being a presenter for the FDA?
Well, similar to the 3 previous times where I presented to this committee, the whole process is pretty whacked. We are asked to submit an application, a letter submission as to what we want to talk about. Now, at the time, that only information we had was a press release from Pfizer. We didn't have any actual data. We just had some top numbers. We didn't really have a chance to look at it. So I had to submit a letter basically saying, this is what I want to talk about, but I really didn't have an opportunity to express further. Okay, that's fine. We made it a pretty generic type of thing so that I can fill in the blanks. Once I got accepted, within 2 days, I had to submit the slide presentation. Now, just the night before is when the data started to come out. And so to be able to look at 40 pages and to create a slide presentation at the same time was certainly not as optimal as possible, to the point where I wasn't even able to get through all the data by the time that the slide needed to be presented.
Right.
So
I was just going to say, and this is something that working with you as an executive on your team that we discovered the last 3 times too. And it sort of starts to beg questions as to why is it being done like this? And, are they actually really wanting the type of feedback that they're telling us that they want? Because they're asking you to present on data that you have not yet been able to review by the time you have to put your slides in. So let me move on to asking you this. Some of the basic points that I know you made mention of. One is that you're seeing in your pediatric practice more hesitancy regarding this age group of parents ages 5 through 11 years old than you even did for adolescents 12 and above, right? And I'm wondering if you can share a little bit about how this is being portrayed in the media.
So I've actually seen the media portraying this pretty well. It's very understood that young children, especially of these age groups, they're not just small adolescents, and they're certainly not just small adults. And there's different considerations that are going to be taken into account for this population. We've known since the beginning that the likelihood of severe disease, if a person were to catch COVID, of these younger children, the morbidity and mortality is significantly lower. So, of course, when one is weighing a pro versus con, what should I do? That's one of the things that they're going to take into account. But they're also recognizing that parents who are not even, parents who even may have been vaccinated themselves may not necessarily be comfortable going ahead and doing it to their young children. And so we're kind of looking at a different population in terms of the hesitancy that people may have, and the considerations may be different.
Right. Now, one of the things that I've noticed is that there is a little bit more nuanced of a conversation that's happening right now, which I very much appreciate because I have not found the vaccine consideration discussion in our media to be overly nuanced. It's been a very yes or no, which has sort of helped foster this attitude that if somebody chooses to not get vaccinated or to not get their child vaccinated, that they are a quote unquote anti-vaxxer. Is that your experience of these parents?
Well, I mean, a lot of parents have done it for themselves. Certainly the grandparents have done it. But when they're looking at this, they're looking and saying, do I have enough data in order to assess the risk? Okay. The data that came forth does show that the efficacy, the antibody response for these kids who were given the vaccine was very good. It very much met what the older children, the adolescents and what adults did, taking 1/3 of the dose. So if the simple question being asked is, does the vaccine elicit a strong immune response that should provide protection for somebody? The answer is yes. It certainly does seem to be there from that perspective.
Okay. So let me ask you a question. What we're going to do in this show is we're going to start with some generalizations, and then we're going to dig really deeply into some of the questions that the parents are asking you. So we're going to come back to that in much more detail. One of the things that I want to look at is you have a general overall approach that you tend to take when it comes to vaccines, whether it's a COVID vaccine or another vaccine. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about a little bit of your approach regarding optimization of nutrition and lifestyle, but also some of the general things that you talk to people about when they come to you wanting to do a vaccine consultation, because I know people come of all ages come to you wanting to talk about vaccines. So give us a little bit of sort of your overall approach.
Certainly. So one of the key things that I find are asking open-ended questions. You know, if it's if a new family is coming to me who I don't know whether they've had any vaccines or not, so that's a basic question I ask. Has your children received any vaccines so far? And sometimes you'll hear, yes, my child is fully vaccinated and I intend to keep it that way. And I have other times families who say, well, we've been selected, or we kind of feel that certain vaccines were more relevant. And so we decided that we would go there. And some parents are like, you know, I have a young child. We haven't even gotten that far yet. So it really, again, that's part of the individuality. You can't just ask a blanket question to everybody, because you kind of have to get a sense of where they're at. But then also, like, what is your desires here? How do you, how do you wish to proceed with vaccines? Some parents will say to me, listen, I'm following the schedule. This is what the CDC has put out there. This is how I want you to proceed. And of course, I have other families who say to me, we are not interested in giving our kids vaccines. We wish to optimize their nutrition. We have, we've learned about ways of keeping people healthy, and that's what we're choosing to do. And of course, but I have a lot of families who are like, we're just not sure how we wish to proceed. That's kind of why we're here, is we
Right.
want to kind of be discussing these pros versus cons. How can we make our immune system strong? But also, if we're going to vaccinate, are there things that we can do to strengthen the immune system, moderate the immune system, not allow inflammation from getting out of control, which is what happens when people have vaccine reactions,
Right.
medication reactions, or viral reactions?
Right. So I know that you've shared, let's talk, so we talked about the general, we'll go back to sort of talking about the COVID vaccine specifically. I know that one of the things that you instill with people, if they don't know, is some very basics about how immunity works. And that in the case of COVID, as is the case with most infections, that the way it works is you either have had the virus and therefore your body has generated a natural response, or if you get a vaccine and your body develops some type of immunity that way. Now, one of the things that we're noticing and we're being told regarding the COVID vaccine is that we are seeing in a matter of sometimes 6 months, that the strength and the duration of the immunity really varies. And so I know that one of the things you do is you talk to parents about some of their exposure levels. You talk to them about their overall health, whether or not they've had negative responses to vaccines in the past. And so how do you differ from approaching this compared to a lot of other pediatric offices?
Yeah, and of course, to point out that the immunity from natural infection also does wane over time and is also variable. Okay, so there's both. That's true coming from both sides. Now, what we are seeing, though, to be clear, is that there is a fair amount of data that is implying that people who have had COVID, that their immunity may very well be lasting longer. That's something that was shown in the Israeli data, and of course, they may also have more complete protection, because when a person gets a vaccine, they do mount a very strong response against the spike protein. Now, that is very important, because the spike protein is how the virus enters into our cells to infect the cells, kind of like a key fitting into a keyhole. Okay. Now, but our immune systems are not just going to want to attack that, but if a person has had wild disease, they have antibodies against other proteins besides the spike protein
Right.
that are there. So when the body sees the virus again, that there are more potential attack spots on that virus to code it so that the immune system can recognize it and stop and destroy it and stop it from getting into the cells.
Right. And so what I'm curious to know is, um, how does your practice approach vaccine hesitancy? I know, some pediatric offices won't even allow you to remain a patient if you're not vaccinating your child on the CDC schedule. I know that a lot of people come to you as a trusted source of information because of the fact that you do not do that. They feel that you will give them a well-rounded answer. So how do you usually approach parents? What tactics do you use to discuss this with parents?
Right. So first of all, I think that being respectful. And I mean, I've heard so many times from parents who have transferred into the practice that they were made to feel horrible by the doctors or the other providers that they were seeing, or they had a similar reaction in an emergency room. And that doesn't get anywhere in terms of having a healthy relationship with the family, let alone allowing them to kind of breathe on this, to think about this in order to kind of come up to their decisions. So first and foremost, I kind of don't allow the pressure to be put on them. Okay. People know that I do take a different approach and that I do take a pro-choice approach when it comes to most things with medicine, and certainly when it comes to vaccines, lifestyle, etc. I do believe that a person needs to educate themselves. The parent needs to educate and then make the best decision for their child, because at the end, that's what they want to do. Nobody's sitting here saying, I'm going to make a terrible decision for my child, so I'm not going to do this, or I am going to do this. They're trying to assess this. So that's the first thing, is just kind of putting out there that this is a safe space for them to talk. I want to hear what types of things they're hearing. What are they making their decisions on, or what haven't they made their decisions on? But like, what data, what information are they hearing? Because sometimes I hear things that are rather debunkable and just really do not make any sense from a scientific perspective, or the data clearly shows that what they're talking about is really not proven to be true. Now, of course, I'm not going to say to them, you're an idiot because you think that. I'm going to say, well, let's talk about where you're getting that information from, or can you share that with me? Maybe I haven't heard that's a study or that of what you're talking about. I'm wanting to listen. I want to hear. And that's another thing, listening to people, is
Right.
hearing where they're coming from. And that's
Right.
a really, really important thing.
So, as I said earlier, you do a lot of focus on nutrition and lifestyle. You consult with people of all ages. And some of the people that come to you after they speak with you, you create a non-threatening way, you educate them. And some people, choose to vaccine. Some people don't. Some people do a different schedule. Some people wait and see. But I know one of the really big things that you talk about is really having people make a benefit and a risk list for themselves. A benefit of if I get the vaccine, or risk of if I get the vaccine, and the benefits or risk if I catch the virus, in terms of not only the person themselves, but the people around them. So in the interest of time, I want to move us along and talk about the Pfizer studies specifically. Now, the Pfizer, as we mentioned earlier, Pfizer gave what's called a briefing document or briefing data to the FDA committee, and that's what was given to you. Tell me a little bit about the data and what some of your overall takeaways were, without going too deep, but just some of your overall takeaways, the main points that you made to the FDA.
Sure. So there was an initial study that was looking at, it's about, so for at least a 2-month period, where there were 2,250 kids. 750 of them got a placebo effect. 1,500 of them got given a placebo, not the placebo effect, were given a placebo. And so it was a 2-to-1 ratio. 1,500 of them were given the vaccine. And for this, they were looking at both the antibody levels that were being risen, were they developing symptoms, and were they developing any side effects. So with that, they showed, first of all, that and they were given a 10 micrograms, 1/3 of the dose that had been given to adolescents and to adults. What they showed was the antibody responses, by measuring them, the antibodies were equal to what the older people were showing, despite the fact that they got 1/3 of the dose. So that was very promising. One certainly could expect that if lower dose is given, that there's less of a chance of a side effect. In terms of from a side effect perspective, they did not find any serious side effects in this myocarditis or anything else, but also we recognize that these are uncommon side effects that may very well not be picked up with this type of smaller study. Now, they did also add another 2,500 kids after that original 2,500, which they were looking for at least 2 weeks for side effects. So there was actually 3,750 kids who were looking at side effects. They also were looking for symptomatic disease. And they did find that 90% of the children that did not develop any side effects. Now, it didn't mean that they weren't asymptomatic and couldn't potentially spread it along. But in terms of showing symptoms, and we know that if a person's symptomatic, we know it is more likely that they're going to pass it along.
Right. So really quick correction, just of data, because you had said it earlier correctly and then said it a little bit erroneously. It was not 2,500 in each of those groups. It was 2,250 in each of those two studies. Anyway, I just wanted to correct that for the record. Now, I know that that you see this as being promising data. I know that you're glad that you can share the Pfizer briefing data with parents, that you can also let them know that the safety and efficacy studies are going to be going on for 2 years. This is not something that's just been stopped. But I know that there was also a caveat that was put out, and I'm wondering if you could just share what that was.
Yeah. So, part of the risk versus benefit question takes into account such as how likely is the virus going to be spreading as we go forward, which of course we don't know. I think we will know a lot more after this winter, and we see do we see the same types of huge spike that we saw last winter as we got into January, February, and then it kind of cooled off as we got into March, April, or do we see much less? And that would certainly tell us that if it's much less, that we have attained some very nice herd immunity, which of course is a combination of people who have had the disease, which is a lot. There's probably 150 million people, if not more, in America who have caught the disease. And then, of course, the number of people have been vaccinated, both kids as adults, which is also probably around that same number as well. So, again, it'll be interesting to see, and I think we will be able to make more assessment by then. Now, of course, the counter to that is, well, should people be protecting themselves? Because what if there is going to be a spike after all because immunity has waned off, etc. So that's again a decision that people are going to make, and we're not going to have that type of data until after the effect. Right. The most likely time that we will see a spike will be this winter, which will also be before we've had a couple of months to really assess what's happening, not just in the studies, but what's happening in the broad population.
Right. So I know that one of the people that was interviewed said that, the caveat, one of the things that parents will look at as parents are kind of doing this risk benefit analysis is what are the infection rates like in the area that they live in, because it's not the same across the board. Some areas are very low and some are very, very high. And so if you're living in an area where your levels are pretty low, around the levels that we had back in June, when we thought hopefully this was in our rear view mirror, it may be possible that the number of kids who are hospitalized because of a symptomatic infection or otherwise get myocarditis or something like pericarditis, that could outweigh the number of people, like in terms of the equation that you're considering. So I'm going to use this as a segue, unless there's something you wanted to say about that.
Yeah, I think that's putting the cart way ahead of the horse, in honesty. And I don't think that it's right and fair to make a decision based upon that question. Okay, we do not know that. So there's nothing that tells us that there will be more hospitalizations from a myocarditis than there will from the vaccine, which one of the things that has been shown, and again, why we need more data, the myocarditis that has been seen, especially in the younger adults and the adolescents, relatively speaking, has been mild compared to the myocarditis that was seen in the same population for people who caught COVID. Wild natural COVID causes myocarditis. And it seems to happen more frequently, and it seems to happen more severely relative to the people who took the vaccine. So that's an important thing. Not all myocarditis should be equal as, it's not like death or not death, right? So there are those types of things. There haven't been nearly as many people who have been severely ill or damaged in their heart when they've had it from the vaccine. So I think that that's an important point for people to understand.
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that. So I want to move on the conversation and talk about some of the main questions that you're hearing from parents. And so we'll do this as not a speed round, but a little bit, where I'm going to ask you a question and just give us sort of like a general approach, as if I was almost sitting in your office and we had a limited amount of time and you were kind of asking. So the first question is it likely that the vaccine is going to result in a significant reduction of pediatric hospitalizations or death, especially in light of the fact that the outcomes for those two things, hospitalization and death, are already very rare in children?
So if one talks about a statistical analysis where they're actually able to say that, yes, this is more than just chance, it's going to be hard for us to understand that. There's probably going to need to be millions of people, millions of children to get the vaccine for us to make that type of comparison. There's been less than a few hundred kids nationally who have died. Not that every life is not critical and important and precious, but the number of children nationally who have died from COVID is pretty darn small relative to the population. Now, there's been certainly more hospitalizations because there's always going to be more hospitalizations than there are going to be deaths. Now, it is felt that 2/3 of the kids who are hospitalized have some type of pre-existing condition, whether it's an immunity issue, cancer, obesity, asthma, some underlying chronic condition, but approximately of the third of the kids didn't seem to have any type of pre-existing condition. So that's also one of the things to take into consideration is, for a parent who has a child who doesn't have that pre-existing type of condition, there's going to need to be even more children because there's less numbers to compare it against. So I think it's going to be very difficult until we have a time where we can see that type of data. And so again, I recognize that parents are asking the question now if this is something that they should do. And there's going to have to be some level of leap of faith because we're just not going to be able to present the type of information that I would like to be able to share with them.
Right. And a leap of faith in both directions, right? A leap of faith is if you decide to not get your kid vaccinated, a leap of faith if you decide to get your kid vaccinated. So I know that the Pfizer data, at least what we were presented with, showed, like you mentioned earlier, a 90% reduction of symptomatic cases among the population. So how does that equate, or how does that affect one of the other questions, which is the vaccine expected to reduce the family and community spread? So not is the kid going to get sick, but might this reduce the spread amongst the family and the community?
And I think that there's a good yes on that one. So if there's 90% reduction in symptomatic disease, which as we mentioned before, if you're symptomatic, you're more likely to spread it, then of course the adults at home, the grandparents that the child may be exposed to, if there's a 90% reduction in symptoms, we're going to see a significant less likelihood of a child catching it, even if they have a mild disease, and passing it along to an adult. Now, of course, one can imagine that if a child is being vaccinated, there's a really, really strong likelihood that their parents are going to be, because that's just the way that things are going to go in terms of those patterns. So then, of course, and of course, the grandparents as well. So now we're talking about, will kids be bringing something home to a vaccinated population? Now, of course, counter to that is the fact that we are seeing breakthrough infections, certainly not common, a third of people, but, I think it's about 2 to 5% of the population is seeing this. So now we can ask the question, is the kid going to decrease the likelihood of bringing something home to a parent who would have a breakthrough infection, or the grandparent who had a breakthrough infection? And again, I don't know how you're going to quantify that with any type of numbers, but there is that theoretical. Now, of course, there's conversations about boosters, and of course, the highest risk people would be more likely getting the boosters as well as an adult. So, there's still going to need to be leap of faith in all of these directions because we're just not going to know. But does logic tell me if it's less likely for a kid to bring it home, then it's less likely for it to spread amongst the family? That kind of seems like a yes. So I just can't say, but it's at this level of percentage.
Sure. Now, one of the things that I know people also want to know about is this whole idea of long haul COVID, right? COVID is you get an infection and you may think you're better, but for some people, it continues for months and months and months, sometimes even over a year. They still have some kinds of symptoms, memory, smell, this kind of stuff. Is there any evidence or any belief that the vaccine could reduce the pediatric long haul incidence that's to be expected?
Yeah, and it's also should be noted that there are people who develop long hauler who are asymptomatic from the original infection. Okay, so then that's really weird. Where's that coming from? But there's been definitely documented cases. We know somebody who that personally happened to. Okay, very minimal disease,
Right.
And then went on to have some pretty significant long haul chronic fatigue. So long hauler symptoms are going to be less likely in children also. I've seen it some adults, and I've seen it in some adolescents. I don't recall ever having any family who said my kid had COVID who are saying, and we're having long hauler as well. Now, I've had some families who say, yeah, a cough has lingered for 6 to 8 weeks. But I haven't had anybody who have said to me, man, my kid is chronically fatigued now. Man, my kid is, sense of smell and the taste, haven't come back. I mean, that's, some people say it's it, but, not long-term types of issues there. So again, if we're talking about a population that is, again, less likely to have the symptom, then of course, to be able to assess if the vaccine is reducing that, You're going to need a large sample size in order to do that. And certainly that was not what was part of the sample. In fact, the FDA admits there's also not enough data from this sample size to even know about long-term effects anyways. I mean,
And that was
long-term, I'm sorry?
That's one. Sorry to interrupt. That's one of the things I was going to ask you about. Right. One of the questions that we're getting a lot is, was the sample size adequate? So here were some numbers that we sort of deduced based on the number of people that were in the study. If at each year of age it was equal number, right? So if there was, say 400 at age 5, there'd be 480. So what we deduced is that from ages 5 through 7, there would be approximately 1,600 people that were in the study, and again, some of those received the placebo, right?
No, that would actually be who would have received the vaccine.
Okay, so 1,600 ages 5 through 7, and then for ages 8 and 9, and also again for ages 10 and 11, there was 1,100 in each of those groups. So do you have anything that you want to share regarding that sample size?
Yeah, so a 5 to 7 year old is so different than a 10 to 11 year old. A 10 to 11 year old, they're hitting the hormones already, some of them, probably closer to what a 12-year old. So could people extrapolate for their younger, their older people in this age group? But there's nothing to extrapolate against for a 5 to 7 year old. So,
Right.
it's almost like we're looking at those numbers anew.
Okay. So I know that one of the things that we'll talk about, later on down the road as we get more information is how is this vaccine going to be even distributed through society? I know that we're being told from the federal government that they're going to try and take an all hands on approach. It may occur at pediatric offices. It may occur at pharmacies. It may occur at schools. And we don't have a lot of information on that yet. So we will come back to that question, which is another question parents have asked. I do want to ask one more question before we start to wrap up, which is what are some of the ways that parents and families can try to reduce inflammation or at least moderate inflammation, that they can optimize nutrition, which are all things that would both make side effects from a vaccine be reduced, the likelihood of that, but it would also potentially, if they catch the virus, make those symptoms potentially less acute as well.
Yeah. So certainly if you've been listening to me as a patient or seeing previous posts, vitamin D, zinc, not just people taking it, measuring your levels and getting them into the middle part of the reference range. So many studies came out in the past year showing that intracellular zinc levels significantly reduces the likelihood of the virus growing inside the cells of our cells if we get infected. Same thing with vitamin D. In fact, they've even shown that people are lower in closer to the sun seem to be able, even in the where they are on the horizontal lines. And closer to the equator, may even have more protection relative to people who are above that. I saw a very interesting study that showed that because they're outside more. So that's a really super important thing. And of course, within our practice, we've developed protocols of certain supplements and they're the same ones to take before and after a vaccine, as well as if you first start to get sick, what we refer to as our first signs of illness.
Right.
So the nice thing about this is the same approach seems to be protective for both.
Right. Yeah. And so I want to say that we already have in our queue, because there's, this is obviously a passion of Dr. David's and it's something people want to know about. We are going to do entire episodes and lots of Ask Dr. David's as well regarding good vitamin D and zinc levels, how you achieve that, how you measure it, the importance of it, and sort of probably more than you ever wanted to know about vitamin D and zinc. If you're going to be hanging out with Dr. David, that's kind of just something you have to get used to. I know that in terms of optimizing nutrition and moderating inflammation, there's also sort of the basic things that we've all been told since we were younger. Move your body, get physical fitness if you can, get adequate sleep, try to minimize stress, have good mental health practices, good sleep etiquette, all of those things. So, all of this works into how strong is our body's sort of fundamental, like the foundation of our body's ability to both fight disease and also ward off inflammation through things such as a virus or the vaccine. So as we wrap up here,
Well,
I know that
I actually want to say something about that.
Yes.
Moderate physical fitness. Okay. Especially obviously the older the kid is, the more likely they're going to be on a football team, a basketball team, etc. If you have COVID or if you start to get any kind of sickness, don't just, I'm going to sweat it out, I'm going to go full, even if it's in training on your own. If you are going to do the vaccine, be chill with your physical fitness. Obviously go for walks, be outside, maybe take a little light run, light jog type of thing, but don't be going hardcore because your immune system is dealing with something major. And when we then push ourselves, our adrenal glands, our overall just state of health, we could push ourselves too far. So being in a moderate but not an extreme could be very, really important for this in terms of like during that time period of when you're sick or if you're going to, or when your person's getting vaccinated.
Got it. And thank you. So as we wrap up here, I wanted to talk about something that I know is dear to your heart, and it is something that you brought up to the FDA, which I think is a really interesting thing because it's not something that we're seeing a lot of in our culture right now on many fronts, but certainly not as it relates to vaccines, which is this idea of being civil to each other, having respect for people, and understanding for people that may be thinking this through in a very different way. Why do you think that that some parents may be making different decisions here? Like, do some parents just not want to make a good decision for their kids, or do you think that they just have a different philosophy around this?
Yeah. Every parent wants to do best by their child. Nobody's going into this saying, I'm going to make a wrong choice so that my child can suffer the consequences. Okay. So that's super important. I mean, kind of as we know, and as we talked about, there are families out there who got vaccinated for themselves and for their, but they have a different approach and a different take on this. So parents are going to need time. I mean, there will be millions of families, I'm sure, who will rush out and they will do it in the first month. And you know what? That will help us get data for families who have more hesitancy. And then there's going to be people who are just going to say, I'm just not going to do this. Okay. So I think it's really important to have grace on people, to be respectful. You know, as I mentioned in the presentation, nobody benefits if we judge and ridicule. We shouldn't be doing that to each other. You know, we can talk. Some say, we answer to our maker, we answer to ourselves, we answer to our families. But at the same time, just being disparaging, calling people names, what does that accomplish except for push people further into their own corners? It doesn't. We have a big, big problem in our country right now with this, and it's getting worse. And our country wasn't like this before. This has just been of the last recent years that there's been this divide that if it's my way or the highway. And, I've just never been that type of person. I've always had patients who have come from different angles on this, and that my job is to help them work themselves through it. I am glad that parents have the choice to use this lower dose product in their children if they feel that this is the best thing for them. That's what we're asking for. We're saying this should be about choice. So, but that also means that if a family, if the people who are strongly anti-vax, okay, that's their thing and that's how they're going to handle their families. But ridiculing people who either as somebody who would be offering a vaccine potentially, or as somebody who's out there saying, hey, I don't know all the answers here, but I think that there is merit to the vaccine, even if it's not 100% versus a 0% summation. But I mean, even if you look in the comments that we make, and I'm sure we'll probably get some from this from this comment from people who are just not looking at it that way. Oh my gosh, you didn't come out and completely bash vaccines. Well, first of all, that's not where I'm coming from, nor is that what I believe. But I believe it's really important for people to say, hey, this is what I'm choosing to do. And I think it's really important as a society for us to say, okay. And even when I do a vaccine consultation and I have a family who has chosen not to vaccinate, or a lot of times families will say to me, this is coming from a general vaccine perspective, we're not quite there yet. We don't know that we want to do this at 2 months. Maybe but I do want to bring this up in the future. So what happens at the next checkup? I know last time that you told me that you were wishing to defer vaccines, or even I know you told me last time that you weren't going to vaccinate. Do you have any changes of heart? Do you have any questions for me? Is there anything that I can further clarify so that you can continue to make the decisions that you think is best for your child?
Right. And I think it's really important. And as I said, this is one of the things that we often are struck by, that your philosophy is so much about choice, so much about education, respect, choice, all of these different things, recognizing that everybody's situation is different. And even if we say that a million times, somehow we still seem to get told that we're proposing one side or the other. And, maybe sometimes if we have two people saying you're doing this and you're doing that, and neither one of them is true, maybe we're doing something right. But it is also frustrating for you. I know that, to feel that people are sometimes misrepresenting your point of view, calling you an anti-vaxxer sometimes, or saying that you're pushing vaccines, right? So, both of those two things, neither of those two things are true. So I think it really does highlight, though, the importance of understanding, taking a step back, civility, all of these things. So we are going to wrap up this episode. We could probably talk a lot about this. This is a very hot issue. We also have another episode on vaccine mandates. You can check that out on this channel. We invite you to subscribe to this channel because we're going to continue to dive into these really important issues. We ask that you follow us on social media, and please go into the comment section. Give us some thoughts on this episode. Let us know if there's some questions that you would like Dr. David to address and for us to discuss. Any parting notes, Dr. David?
No, I wish everybody well, and both the strength and the courage and the wisdom to make the best decisions for themselves and for their families.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. We really appreciate you joining us, and we hope to see you again soon.